Chapter 1. The Impossible Disappearance. It was on the 29th of October, in that restless season when London is half buried in fog and soot, that I first heard of the matter concerning the Reverend Tobias Merrow, Vicar of Dunstable, Holmes, and I had just returned from a tedious errand involving a forged signature, and a woman convinced her cat was a reincarnated Duke of Monmouth. Holmes, with his usual disdain for the melodramatic and metaphysical, had resolved the affair with brisk precision, and was now settled into his armchair, long legs extended, pipe in hand, the fire casting sharp shadows on the Persian rug. I had barely opened the morning's post when a knock sounded at the door of 221B Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps preceded a familiar voice, clipped, exasperated, and unmistakably that of Inspector Lestrade. "Come in, Lestrade," Holmes called before the door was fully open. "You sound like a man burdened by either scandal or absurdity." Lestrade entered with the weariness of one who had dealt with both. "It's a disappearance," he said, removing his gloves, "of the most extraordinary kind." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Ordinary men vanish with troubling regularity. What makes this one extraordinary?" Lestrade hesitated. "The man disappeared from within a locked church, during a service, in full view of half his parish." That earned Holmes's full attention. He sat up. "A locked church," he repeated. "With witnesses?" "Yes, and not a soul saw him. Go." Holmes turned his gaze to me. "Pack a bag, Watson. We're going to Bedfordshire." The village of Dunstable lay nestled among low rolling hills and ancient trees, its thatched roofs and winding lanes giving it the appearance of a place untouched by time. The fog that trailed us from Euston Station lifted only slightly as we stepped from the train. A constable met us at the platform and led us directly to the Church of St. Sed's, a stern Norman structure surrounded by moss-covered gravestones and late-blooming chrysanthemums. Lestrade gestured at the heavy oak doors as we approached. The Reverend was conducting evensong on Thursday last. He stood in the pulpit, scripture in hand, voice steady, when the lights flickered during the final hymn. When they steadied again, he was gone. "Gone?" Holmes echoed, tapping the door's iron hinges. "Completely. No one saw him leave. The vestry was locked. The side doors were bolted from within. The only key was in the vicar's coat, which was left neatly hanging on its peg." Holmes gave a soft hum of approval, his expression bright with interest. "Did anyone hear anything unusual?" I asked. "Only the sudden silence," said Lestrade. "The organist stopped playing. The curate, young fellow named Markham, walked up to the pulpit, thinking the Reverend had fallen ill. But there was nothing. No sign of struggle, no exit, just an open Bible and a faint trace of incense." We entered the church, and I could not help but feel a certain chill as I stepped into the nave. It was a beautiful space, arched ceilings, aged wood, stained glass with the saints in sombre procession. But there was something deeply wrong about it now, a tension in the air, like a held breath. Holmes walked the central aisle slowly, head tilted, gaze sweeping. He approached the pulpit and examined it carefully. His hands moved over the carved wood, tapping gently here and there. "No trapdoor," he muttered. "No hidden mechanism?" He turned to the chancel. "And this curate, Markham, how long has he been here?" "Only 6 months," Lestrade replied. Oxford man, quiet, clean record. He seemed genuinely shaken. All the villagers speak highly of him." Holmes crouched, inspecting a narrow crack between the stone floor slabs. "And the Reverend Merrow?" he asked. "What sort of man was he?" "Beloved," Lestrade said. "Devout, private, bookish. No enemies, as far as we know." "Everyone has enemies, Lestrade," Holmes murmured. "Most just hide them better than others." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "I would like to speak to this Markham," he said, "and to see the Reverend's quarters. Watson, would you be so kind as to inspect the vestry for any signs of forced entry or disturbance?" "Certainly." An hour later, we reconvened at the vicarage. The rooms were spare, neat, and filled with books, sermons, history, Latin translations, and a surprising number of volumes on medieval architecture. Holmes passed his fingers over the spines, his brow furrowed in thought. "He was researching something," Holmes murmured, "and not for pleasure. See here, these are all recent borrowings, focused on ecclesiastical floor plans and burial rites." I looked toward the desk, where a note lay folded beside an inkwell. Holmes picked it up, reading silently. Then he handed it to me. "The truth lies where the saints do not tread. Seek the final word between the bells." I frowned. "Cryptic." "Precisely," said Holmes, "and perhaps intended to be so." Lestrade looked over my shoulder. "What does it mean?" Holmes turned to him with a gleam in his eye. "It means, dear Lestrade, that this is no ordinary disappearance. Reverend Merrow did not vanish. He withdrew, by design or under duress, and he left us a puzzle to find him." Chapter 2. The Curate's. The curate's residence was a modest affair. No more than 4 sparsely furnished rooms above the parish library. Yet there was a quiet charm to it. The books on his shelf were a mix of Greek poetry and sermon guides, and a chessboard lay set on a side table mid-game, as if abandoned in a moment of sudden distraction. Holmes sat lightly in the armchair by the fire, steepling his fingers, while I took the seat beside him, notebook in hand. Across from us sat the Reverend Jonathan Markham, a lean, thoughtful man of no more than 30, with an expression at once eager and exhausted. "I understand this has been a great shock to you, Mr. Markham," Holmes began, his tone courteous but probing. Markham nodded. "A tremendous one, Mr. Holmes. I've been unable to sleep since it happened. I keep reviewing it in my mind over and over, but it makes no sense." "That is often the case, until one finds the correct angle," said Holmes. "Now, I should like you to recount, as precisely as you can, what transpired that evening." Markham leaned forward, hands clasped. "It was the usual evensong. The Reverend Merrow and I took our places at the beginning of the service. He delivered the readings, beautifully I might add, and gave the sermon. Nothing unusual. During the final hymn, the light flickered. There was a brief dimming of the gas lamps, but it lasted only seconds. When the hymn concluded, I turned to look for him, and he was no longer in the pulpit. Was the church entirely dark during the flicker? No, dim, but not black. We could still see. Did you hear any footsteps? Movement behind the pulpit? A door closing? Nothing. Holmes's fingers drummed on the armrest. Did the Reverend seem different that day? Distracted? Uneasy? Markham hesitated. Now that you mention it, yes. He was quieter than usual. Not fearful exactly, but weighed down. I thought it was the matter of the bishop's inquiry. Holmes's eyes flashed. What inquiry? Markham looked startled. You haven't heard? There was a small complaint lodged against the Reverend. Nothing of substance, I'm sure, but the bishop was said to be reviewing his record. What sort of complaint? Markham's voice lowered. Whispers mostly. That he'd misused church funds, though I never believed it. The Reverend was the soul of discretion and honesty. And yet, said Holmes, rising to examine the shelves, there must be something that made him fear exposure, or prompted someone to ensure he could not speak further. Markham stood. You don't believe he left of his own accord? Holmes turned back, his expression unreadable. I believe he disappeared under highly specific conditions. Whether by his hand or another's remains to be seen. Back at the church, Holmes insisted we examine the pulpit once more. This is no ordinary structure, he remarked, brushing his fingers along the woodwork. Note the ornamental column here, hollow. And this moulding beneath the baseboard is newer than the rest. I leaned closer. A reconstruction. Yes, likely within the last 5 years. Perhaps when they restored the altar rail. Holmes crouched, running a slim blade between the wood and the stone step. With a soft click, a section of the pulpit base gave way, revealing a narrow gap. No more than a foot in width, but enough to suggest a hidden space. Watson, he murmured. Light. I passed him my lantern. He held it to the opening, revealing a dark descending tunnel just behind the pulpit. A passageway, I said, but where does it lead? That, Holmes said, is what we are about to find out. The hidden staircase was steep and narrow, leading down into the ancient foundations of the church. We emerged into a cramped crypt, the air thick with dust and the scent of damp stone. Sarcophagi lined the walls, unmarked and long forgotten. Holmes's lantern revealed scuff marks on the flagstones, fresh ones. Someone came this way recently, he said, within the last 2 days. He moved with deliberate steps toward the far wall, where the stone had been disturbed. A smaller tunnel extended beyond, roughly cut, and no wider than a man's shoulders. I swallowed. This couldn't have been part of the original design. No, said Holmes. This was carved later, likely during one of the Reformation era. Rebuilds. A priest hole or smuggler's run. But what matters is that someone knew it was here. Someone used it. Then the vicar escaped. Holmes turned, or was taken. We returned to the surface by dusk, emerging into the cool breath of early evening. The last of the sun glazed the church roof in gold. Holmes stood by the nave entrance, eyes sweeping the horizon, as if reading a cipher written in treetops and smoke. What do you make of it, Holmes? I asked. He exhaled slowly. The Reverend Merrow vanished from a locked room. We have now established a means of exit, but not a reason. Or more precisely, we lack the truth of that reason. He paused. But that will change, I suspect, when we speak to the vicar's sister. Sister? She arrived at the station this morning from Exeter, staying with the curate, I believe, and she may prove very enlightening indeed. Chapter 3. A visitor from Exeter, Miss Eliza Merrow, had the unmistakable bearing of a woman who had learned, through years of quiet observation, how to navigate the world without ever appearing to take up space. She was tall, spare in frame, with pale, clear eyes that flicked between Holmes and myself with the subtle precision of someone assessing a chessboard mid-match. She had arrived that morning from Exeter, summoned by telegram after her brother's vanishing act. The curate had graciously offered his guest bedroom, and it was there that we now found her, seated beside a modest valise, gloved hands resting atop her lap, her dark dress spotless despite the wear of travel. "I thank you for coming, Miss Merrow," Holmes began. "I imagine these are trying circumstances." Her voice, when she replied, was soft but unshaking. "You imagine correctly, Mr. Holmes. I was sent for with the news that my brother had vanished. I did not expect, however, to arrive and find no one certain whether he is dead, kidnapped, or hiding." "Would you say," Holmes asked, "that your brother was the sort of man likely to disappear voluntarily?" Miss Merrow's lips tightened. Timothy was a man of principle and unwavering duty. He loathed melodrama. The notion that he would sneak away like a disgraced curate in a penny novel is absurd. Holmes raised an eyebrow slightly, then leaned forward. "Did he confide in you? Recently, I mean. Any private concerns? Disturbing letters? Odd behaviour?" "He did write last week," she said after a pause. "It was not like him." Holmes's eyes lit. "Not like him, how?" "He was elliptical, vague. He said he was troubled by something long buried, and that the truth must be faced, even if it arrives too late." "And did he specify what this truth might be?" "No," she said quietly, but the tone chilled me. There was something final in it, as if he feared the consequences of saying more. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes asked, "Was there anyone from his past, distant relatives, old acquaintances, who might have resurfaced recently?" Miss Merrow shook her head. "We had a distant cousin, but he's been dead 15 years. Timothy never married, had no children. The parishioners adored him. He lived simply. Books and sermons were his only indulgence. Were you close?" "As close as a brother and sister could be, living miles apart." There was a curious stiffness to her tone now, and Holmes, who never missed a tremor in a sentence, tilted his head. "You did not approve of his calling?" "I respected it," she said curtly. "I did not envy it." A pause. "Did something divide you, Miss Merrow?" Her gaze flicked to Holmes, then dropped. "There was an inheritance, 10 years ago, a family house in Devon. It was left to Timothy. I believed it had been promised to me." Holmes was silent a moment. "And have you seen the property since?" "I visited once, shortly after his appointment to Dunstable. He had it sold, quietly, without much ceremony." "Do you believe the sale was above board?" "I never questioned it, though in hindsight—" She hesitated. "He did seem unusually relieved to be rid of it." Holmes gave a slight nod, as if placing a piece in a mental puzzle. As we stepped out into the afternoon air, I couldn't help but voice my thoughts. "You think there's more to that house than she knows?" "Of course," Holmes said lightly. "Or rather, more than she is willing to admit she suspects. Her brother's vague reference to the past aligns too neatly with her resentment over the property. It is the sort of emotional fissure upon which great crimes are quietly built." "You believe she's lying?" "No, Watson, merely concealing. There is a difference. And it may yet be essential." He paused to light a cigarette. "What strikes me is the precision of the event, The locked church, the vanishing pulpit, the suggestion of a voluntary disappearance paired with the echo of compulsion. No ransom demand, no public statement, only silence, I said. Then what's your theory? Holmes exhaled slowly, eyes narrowed against the wind. I have none yet, but I intend to walk the graveyard. The cemetery behind the Church of St. Sed's was one of the oldest in the region. Tombstones leaned at precarious angles, names long eroded as ivy clawed over cracked marble, and moss softened the outlines of the dead. Holmes paced slowly among the markers, pausing occasionally to crouch and inspect a detail invisible to the untrained eye. After 10 minutes he stopped. Watson. I joined him by an old vault at the edge of the grounds. It bore the name Ashcombe, and the year 1803. A heavy stone door sealed its entrance, flanked by rusted iron rings. Holmes bent and pointed to the soil near the base. Disturbed earth. Recently turned. Someone opened the vault? Perhaps. Not fully, but someone was here, and not long ago. See the faint smudge on the door? I did see it now. A handprint barely visible in the low light. Curious, I said. More than that, Holmes replied. Suspicious. He turned toward the church. This crypt, this passage, this graveyard, they are all parts of a design. One we have yet to understand. That evening, back at the inn, Holmes paced while I attempted to order my notes. At the heart of this case, he said, lies an invisible action, not the disappearance itself, but the motive behind it. We are seeing the ripples, Watson, not the stone. There was a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, face flushed, holding a small envelope. This just arrived, addressed to me but no return. Holmes took it, opened it, and read aloud, You have come too far. Let the dead remain where they lie. This is not your concern. The letter was unsigned. Holmes handed it to me. The paper was cheap, the hand crude but steady. Watson looked up. A warning? Indeed, said Holmes, and now we know we are nearer the truth than someone would like. Chapter 4. A Grave. Interrupted dawn arrived in Dunstable on a tide of mist and gold. The fog clung to the trees like cobwebs, and the bell of St. Sed's tolled 6 in the distance, low, deliberate, and mournful. Holmes, already awake and fully dressed, stood by the window of our rooms at the village inn, peering into the dim morning light with narrowed eyes. The letter was no idle threat, he said, without turning. It was a marker, an attempt to draw a line we are not meant to cross. I stirred my tea and watched him warily. And yet, I said, it has done little more than stiffen your resolve. Precisely. He drew back from the window and reached for his coat. Watson, fetch your boots. We are going to visit the Ashcombe vault. The vault? At this hour? Holmes smiled faintly. I find the secrets of the dead are often most talkative at first light. We reached the graveyard just as the mist began to lift. The wet grass clung to our boots, and the sharp scent of damp earth filled the air. We moved quickly and quietly, carrying a spade Holmes had borrowed from the inn's stable hand, who had asked no questions, though I suspected he would form theories of his own before breakfast. At the Ashcombe tomb, Holmes paused. Observe the moss along the edges, he said. Still bruised. The disturbance is recent. possibly within the last 48 hours. I glanced around, and no one in the village has reported seeing anything. Which means, Holmes replied, whoever came here was very careful, or very familiar with the grounds. He crouched and inserted a slim iron lever into the seam where the stone door met its frame. With a grunt, he gave it a push. The door groaned as it shifted, releasing a breath of stale, cold air. We stepped inside. The interior was small, no, more than 10 feet square, with 3 stone slabs along the far wall, each one bearing the faded initials of Ashcombe ancestors long gone. Cobwebs clung to the corners. A pair of rusted sconces suggested the space had not been entered in decades, but the dust betrayed the lie. Holmes held up his lantern. Footprints, one set, coming in, then leaving again. I followed his gaze. The prints were faint but visible, narrow, with a slightly pronounced heel. Men's shoes but light in step, not the sort worn by villagers. He knelt, brushing away more dust from beneath the far slab. "Here," he murmured. I crouched beside him. Carved into the floor beneath the slab was a shallow recess, no more than 2 inches deep and lined with worn lead sheeting. Inside it, nearly hidden from view, lay a single folded piece of cloth. Holmes retrieved it and opened it carefully. A clerical stole. Plain black linen, worn with age and stitched nearly invisible in black thread near the seam, were the initials, T.M. Timothy Merrow, I said, breath catching. Holmes nodded slowly. "It appears the vicar has been here, or someone very much wishes us to think so." We returned to the village as the sun crept above the treetops, casting long shadows across the green. At the inn, Lestrade awaited us in the dining room, poring over a local map with evident frustration. "You've been up half the night," Holmes said lightly as we entered. Lestrade looked up. "And what of you? Gone off without a word. Again." Holmes tossed the stole onto the table. Lestrade blinked, then swore softly. "Is that—" "Yes," Holmes said. "Found beneath the Ashcombe tomb. A place recently visited by someone who did not wish to be seen." Lestrade rubbed his brow. "So what now? Is the vicar hiding underground like some bloody fox?" "Unlikely," said Holmes. "If he placed this there himself, it was either as a message or a decoy. But I believe someone else brought it to misdirect us." Lestrade frowned. "Then you think he's still alive?" Holmes was silent for a moment, then said, "I think he may be, but not for long, if we fail to act quickly." That afternoon, Holmes requested access to the church archives, housed in a small stone building adjacent to the rectory. The documents within stretched back to the 17th century. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, bequests. But it was a single entry from 1872 that caused Holmes to stiffen. He tapped the page with one slender finger. "Watson, look." I leaned closer. Baptism. Eliza Ann Merrow, daughter of Tobias Merrow and Anne Ashcombe. Godmother, Miriam Calthorpe, witnessed by the Reverend Henry T. Lawson. "Merrow's mother was an Ashcombe?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "And thus connected to the very tomb we visited this morning." He turned the page. Baptism, Tobias Edwin Merrow, 1841. Father, Edwin Merrow. Mother, unknown. Holmes looked up. "There's more here than meets the eye." Eliza's connection to the Ashcombs is direct, and thus to the land itself. She may have a claim, one her brother perhaps never disclosed. If a secret deed, a buried will, or some legal irregularity exists, it could explain quite a lot. "And if she discovered it?" I said slowly. "Or he did?" "Then we are looking not at a disappearance, but at a struggle for inheritance, with ancient roots and modern consequences." By evening we returned to the rectory to speak once more with the curate. But it was not Reverend Markham who answered the door. It was Eliza. Her expression was unreadable. "You've been digging, Mr. Holmes." "Not just in graves," he said evenly. She did not ask. "A sin. I know about the Ashcombs," she said. "I know about the land, but I did not harm my brother." "Then who did?" "I don't know," she said, "but I believe, whoever it was, he trusted them, and that was his undoing." Her voice trembled. I think Timothy discovered something buried, not only in stone, but in trust, and he paid the price. Later, Holmes stood in the graveyard once more, beneath the rising moon. The wind rustled the hedges. The bell tower loomed against the sky. He turned to me. "Watson," he said, "we are close, very close. But we must draw the net tighter. We must bait the trap." I looked at him. "How?" He smiled faintly. "By returning to the church tomorrow, and this time by vanishing ourselves." Chapter 5. Holmes disappears. It was just past 10:30 in the morning when Holmes gave the signal. The congregation of St. Sed's was sparse that Sunday. Perhaps 20 parishioners, most of them elderly villagers, seated respectfully in pews that echoed with the rustle of hymnals and the creak of old wood. The curate, Reverend Markham, stood at the altar in subdued tones of black and silver, delivering a sermon on the perils of pride. The mood in the church was strange, hushed, wary, as though each soul inside had half forgotten their prayers, in light of the recent vanishing. I sat 2 pews back from the pulpit, my gaze on Holmes. He had arrived earlier than I, slipping into the vestry before the service, and emerging only as the bell began to toll. He was dressed impeccably, as always, and took a place halfway down the right aisle. He did not sing during the hymn. He did not stand when prompted. He simply watched. Everyone, everything. It was the second hymn when the lamps flickered, not abruptly, but just enough to stir memory. A momentary dimming like a passing cloud. There was no gust of wind, no blown-out flame. Only the brief, flickering suggestion of déjà vu. And when the lamps steadied, Holmes was gone. There was no outcry, no commotion, perhaps because no one quite realized he had disappeared. But I knew, rose quietly, and made my way to the side aisle, drawing close to the pulpit, eyes flicking to the base, the chancel, the narrow space behind the altar rails. Holmes had vanished in precisely the same fashion as Reverend Merrow, without noise, trace, or passage. Reverend Markham faltered slightly in his reading, then caught himself and pressed on. But his eyes, I noted, were searching the pews, and a fine sheen of sweat had appeared on his brow. I stepped into the vestry, empty. Holmes had not passed through it. I turned, heart beginning to beat faster, and moved to the pulpit itself. There, behind the wooden panel where Holmes had once pointed out a hidden seam, I found what I had hoped and feared to find. The baseboard panel was ajar. I reached for it, then paused. There were faint scuff marks, fresh, sharp impressions, in the dust. Holmes had gone through, but someone had closed the panel behind him. An hour later, I stood in the inn's parlour with Lestrade, explaining what had occurred. "Gone?" he snapped. "Holmes?" I nodded, as silently as the vicar. The pulpit again, the hidden stair beneath. But this time someone was waiting. He had no time to re-emerge. Lestrade swore and paced. Blast it! I told him not to wander alone. Not with things like this. Warnings, graveyard letters. He should have brought a constable. He wanted to provoke a response, I said. He intended to flush the enemy out. He told me he planned to disappear. Only he did not intend to stay gone. Lestrade raked a hand through his hair. "We need to search the crypt again." I nodded grimly. And beyond. Holmes believed there was more down there than old bones and tunnel walls. We returned to the church with torches and 2 local officers, the lot of us descending into the musty stone corridor beneath the pulpit like spelunkers into a tomb. The air grew colder with each step. In the crypt, we found the entrance to the narrow tunnel still undisturbed. The dust showed the prints from our last visit, but now new ones, smaller, sharper, led deeper into the shaft. They curved away through the tunnel's bend and toward darkness. We followed. For 50 yards the tunnel twisted, jagged and uneven, until it opened abruptly into a small stone chamber. And there, seated on a crate beside a flickering oil lamp, was Sherlock Holmes. He looked up as we entered, completely unruffled. "Took you long enough," he said. Lestrade let out a breath that was part groan, part sigh of relief. "Holmes, you bloody fool!" Holmes stood, brushing dust from his trousers. But consider the outcome. I now know what I did not know before. "Which is?" I asked. He gestured behind him. There, against the far wall, lay an iron strongbox, half open, its contents revealed. Parchments, legal deeds, a cracked envelope sealed with wax. The crest on the seal was a faded blend of cross and antler. "The Dieth Ashcombe estate," Holmes said. "The true deed, hidden here for decades, most likely since 1854, when the estate passed unlawfully to the Crown during a clerical error. Someone buried it, literally, rather than see it challenge their claims. And Reverend Merrow?" I asked quietly. Holmes's expression darkened. I believe he found this, or was shown it, and that discovery made him inconvenient to someone. He turned. Someone who knew these tunnels. Someone who feared what light might bring to the old blood of Dunstable. We brought the box to the surface, locking it in the church safe under constable guard. As we stood in the twilight near the rectory gate, Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Tomorrow," he said, "we gather the remaining suspects. One of them tried to frighten me off. Another perhaps tried to silence the vicar. And all have roots tied to the land beneath our feet." "And what of Miss Merrow?" I asked. Holmes was quiet a moment. She may be a sister grieving, or an heir avenging, but until I hear the next voice speak out of turn, we must let the truth come to us. Chapter 6. The Gathering of Shadows. The morning that followed Holmes's discovery beneath the crypt arrived pale and sullen, the sun struggling behind a veil of low silver clouds. A fine mist clung to the hedgerows of Dunstable like breath upon glass, muffling the sounds of hooves on cobbles and the distant tolling of St. Sed's bell. Holmes stood at the window of our room at the inn, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing toward the church tower. On the table behind him sat the iron strongbox, its seal now broken, its contents, deeds, dated letters, and one curious unfinished will, laid out in neat sequence across the pages of his notebook. "They are pieces of the same mosaic," murmured, "and with every hour the image sharpens." "Pieces of what?" I asked, setting aside my teacup. "Of an inheritance stolen," Holmes replied, "and perhaps a murder born of fear that it might be reclaimed." I moved to his side, and yet no body, "which makes the matter more dangerous," Holmes said softly. "When a corpse lies before us, the questions are brutal but finite. In the absence of death, there is only potential, and potential is a weapon in clever hands." He turned suddenly and drew the curtains shut. "Today," he said, "we invite the players to speak, and we shall learn which of them fears silence the most." Holmes had requested that the principal figures in the case gather that afternoon in the nave of St. Sed's, under the pretext of reviewing church records and ensuring community unity amid the uncertain status of Reverend Merrow. To this end, 4 individuals arrived punctually at 3 o'clock. Eliza Merrow, the Reverend Jonathan Markham, Mrs. Agnes Lamble, the vicarage's long-time treasurer, and Mr. Percival Ames, a solicitor of retiring habits and the church's informal legal adviser. Lestrade hovered discreetly near the doors, while Holmes and I stood beneath the altar arch, with Holmes regarding the gathering as though assembling pieces on a chessboard. He opened the meeting with a tone of gentle diplomacy. "I thank you all for attending," he said. "My intention is not to cast aspersions, but to untangle a series of coincidences which, if left unresolved, may shadow this parish for many years to come." He turned to Mrs. Lamble, a sharp-eyed widow with a complexion like polished ivory. "Madam, for how long have you overseen the church's financial records?" 26 years, she replied crisply. "Since before Reverend Merrow came to us." "And have you ever encountered a record of a property held under the Ashcombe name?" Mrs. Lamble frowned. "Ashcombe? That's ancient history. Their land passed into Crown ownership after the line died out, long before I arrived." Holmes nodded, then turned to Mr. Ames. "Mr. Ames, as parish solicitor, you would be aware of any estate anomalies. Have you ever seen these documents before?" He handed him the parchment deed Holmes had discovered in the crypt. The solicitor examined it with a trembling hand, then looked up. "This seal, it's authentic. And this signature, Edwin Merrow, my word. So it's valid?" "Undoubtedly. It transfers Ashcombe lands to Tobias Merrow and his issue." "Dated 1854. Why was this never filed?" "That is precisely the question," Holmes said. "One which someone may have preferred never to ask." At this, Miss Merrow stepped forward. "My brother never spoke of this," she said. "Not once." "But you knew you were an Ashcombe?" Holmes said quietly. Her cheeks flushed. "I suspected. My mother spoke of it once, but only vaguely. She was afraid, I think. There was talk of scandal, property changing hands improperly. My father didn't encourage the subject. Would you have a legal claim? Lestrade asked bluntly. Miss Merrow hesitated. Yes. If Timothy were gone, yes, I would. There was silence. Holmes's eyes moved to Reverend Markham. You've been quiet, Mr. Markham, yet you are the man who was closest to the vicar in recent months. Did he confide anything to you about these documents, or fears for his safety? Markham's face was pale. He said little, but I saw him in the vestry one night, reading over something, a box like that one. He looked disturbed, haunted, even. Holmes moved forward a pace. And yet, he said, you made no mention of this when we first spoke. I didn't think it relevant, Markham said quickly. I thought he was simply troubled. Troubled men don't hide documents in a crypt and then vanish into stone. Markham swallowed. You think he was taken? I think he was threatened, Holmes replied, and someone very near him took advantage of that moment to orchestrate a disappearance, one that might appear divine or impossible, but was neither. Mrs. Lamble's voice cut in, sharp and brittle. Then where is he now? Holmes turned. Somewhere close, I expect. Somewhere he could be held until the right documents were removed, the right stories planted. He paused. But someone made an error. They tried to recreate the very event that caused suspicion in the first place. My own vanishing yesterday. They used the tunnel. They knew the light would flicker. But they forgot something. What? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. And you were the one who kept the books, said Holmes gently. So, if a deed disappeared... It never reached my desk, she said firmly. I don't know who hid it, but I know someone feared it would be found. She set her cup down, hands trembling. I never told the vicar. I wanted to, but I feared dragging it all up would only bring scandal. He had enough to carry. Holmes was silent for a moment, then said, And did you see anyone near the pulpit the night before his disappearance? Mrs. Lamble hesitated, then nodded. The curate, she said. Markham. He was near the pulpit after choir practice. Said he was praying, but he looked troubled, very troubled. Back at the inn, Holmes sat in the fireside chair, turning a pewter coin over in his fingers. A blackmailer, I said. That's new, Holmes nodded. Not altogether unexpected. When a buried secret begins to surface, someone always attempts to profit from it before it explodes. And Mrs. Lamble's claim about Markham? I believe her, Holmes replied. She may be flawed, but she's not a liar. She's afraid. He stood abruptly. We must speak to the curate again, before someone else ensures his silence. We found Reverend Markham in the rectory garden, pruning hedges with a sort of desperate focus. His face was pale, his fingers twitching slightly. At the shears. Mr. Holmes, he said when we approached, is it true you found the Ashcombe deed? Yes, Holmes replied, and much more besides. Markham swallowed. Then it's real. The rumours, the inheritance. Miss Merrow stands to inherit should the Reverend be declared dead, Holmes said carefully. But there is something more pressing, Reverend. Markham looked up. Your behaviour the night before Merrow vanished. He blinked. What do you mean? Mrs. Lamble saw you near the pulpit, not praying, pacing. Markham flushed. She misinterpreted. Holmes studied him. You knew about the crypt? Markham hesitated too long. Yes. I discovered the stairwell by accident. Some months ago, during repairs. I didn't tell anyone. It seemed harmless. But Reverend Merrow knew you had discovered it. I told him in confession, Markham said. I swore to say no more. He said it must remain secret. He feared what it might lead to. And yet someone used that passage. Markham's eyes darted to the hedgerow. I didn't help them, he said, but I think I know who did. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Who? Markham exhaled. There's a boy, Henry Partridge, lives at the old groundskeeper's cottage. Troubled lad, always hovering near the church. I saw him in the crypt once. He ran when I approached. I thought he was just curious. Holmes exchanged a look with me. He may have been used or bribed. Markham nodded. He's clever and desperate. Holmes's voice dropped. Then we must find him before the real architect of this vanishing decides he's a liability. Chapter 8. The Boy in the Usual. Belfry. The old groundskeeper's cottage lay at the very edge of Dunstable's churchyard, where the rows of tombstones gave way to tangled hedgerows and sloping pasture. It was a squat structure, crooked and crumbling with age, its roof bowed, in the centre as though bearing the weight of secrets rather than snow. A single chimney exhaled a thin trail of smoke into the late afternoon air. Holmes and I approached quietly. The light was beginning to fade, and the sky hung heavy with the promise of rain. A murder of crows stirred above the belfry of St. Sed's, their calls echoing across the village like a warning. They forgot I can disappear willingly, but return just as quickly. After the gathering dispersed under the pretext of a mild postponement, Holmes and I returned to the vestry. There he examined the pulpit once more, running his fingers along the inside ridge of the hidden panel. There are marks here, he murmured. Fingernails. Someone tried to open it from the outside, but didn't know the release. He turned to me. This mechanism, this tunnel, only a handful of people knew it existed. The vicar, the curate, possibly Eliza, and, he paused, someone else who has walked this church for decades. Someone who was always present, who had keys, access. My breath caught. Mrs. Lamble? Holmes's eyes glinted. I believe. The final move begins now, Watson. Let us invite Mrs. Lamble for tea. Chapter 7. The woman in the ledgerette was just after 4 in the afternoon when Mrs. Agnes Lamble arrived at the Rose and Wren tea room on the High Street, a modest establishment with a pleasant selection of scones and an excellent view of the churchyard from its corner table. Holmes had reserved this precise table for our casual engagement. I must say, Mrs. Lamble remarked as she seated herself, you gentlemen have a flair for melodrama. Tea as interrogation. It's very modern. Holmes offered her a polite smile. Only tea today, Mrs. Lamble. The questions are but a gentle accompaniment. She regarded him sharply. I've nothing to hide, Mr. Holmes. Holmes poured her a cup and passed the sugar. Oh, I'm sure you believe that. But memory is a tricky creature. Sometimes it needs coaxing. She stirred her tea slowly. If this is about Reverend Merrow, I've told Inspector Lestrade all I know. Holmes leaned forward slightly. And yet there are details that suggest otherwise, such as the ledgers, Mrs. Lamble, the church records. Her spoon clinked softly against the china. I don't follow. Holmes produced from his pocket a small slip of paper folded precisely into thirds. He placed it on the table. During our time in the vestry archives, he said, I reviewed the donation registers under your care. You made a clerical error last month. Mrs. Lamble's brows drew together. I hardly think... A subtraction of £5 from the donation line. A sum listed as miscellaneous upkeep, redirected through a side column. And yet no receipt, no notation. Why? Mrs. Lamble's lips thinned. Petty accounts? I've overseen them for years. Precisely, said Holmes, which is why a mistake struck me as out of character. She said nothing. Holmes continued, gently now. Did you divert that sum, Mrs. Lamble? A pause. It was only temporary. I intended to correct it after All Saints' Day. I needed the funds for personal matters. Holmes's eyes glinted. You were being blackmailed. Thus, got her. Her face froze, and then, slowly, she looked down at her teacup. I thought it was only me, she said softly. A note left at my door. No name, just an instruction. £5 placed in the poor box, delivered on the last Sunday of the month. Holmes nodded. And if you refused... There was a second note. Harsher. I was told to remain quiet about old things, about what happened in 1872. Watson leaned forward. What did happen in 1872? Mrs. Lamble's voice became brittle. That was when the Merrows came. Tobias and his sister. The Ashcombe name still lingered, even after the estate was gone. But there were whispers that something was wrong with the way the property had passed, that someone had suppressed a document. He won't come to the door, Holmes said calmly. Not unless we give him a reason to believe we are not the enemy. And how shall we manage that? I asked. Holmes gave a brief smile. By doing something deeply out of character. Before I could ask what he meant, Holmes picked up a stone and tossed it deliberately into the nearest window. The glass shattered with a sharp crack. Within moments the door burst open. A thin, sharp-faced boy of perhaps 15 stood in the threshold, clutching a length of rusted iron. His hair was wild and his boots were unlaced. He looked less like a vagrant than a child perpetually poised to run. "What do you want?" he barked. "I want to talk," Holmes said, his hands raised peacefully. "That's all. I don't intend to hurt you, Henry." The boy flinched at the sound of his name. "How do you—" "I'm Sherlock Holmes. I know more than I'm meant to. But I'm not here to frighten you." Henry's eyes darted to me, then back to Holmes. "I didn't steal anything." "I don't believe you did," Holmes replied. "But I believe someone asked you to do something. Something you didn't understand the full weight of." The boy hesitated, his grip on the iron bar loosening. Then, with a wary glance over his shoulder, he stepped aside. 5 minutes. The inside of the cottage was sparse but clean. A bed of hay in the corner, a kettle suspended over an open fire, and a few books stacked beside a battered trunk. A map of the village was tacked to the wall, marked with several small black X's, one over the church, another over the Ashcombe tomb. Holmes noticed immediately. "You've been watching." Henry sat on the edge of the bed, arms folded. "Curiosity ain't a crime." "No," Holmes agreed, "but being used for someone else's scheme can become one." The boy looked away. Holmes continued gently now. "Who told you about the passage beneath the church?" There was silence. "No one," Henry mumbled. Holmes waited, letting the pause stretch long enough to become unbearable. Finally, the boy sighed. He said it was just a game. Who did? Henry's jaw clenched. Said I'd get 5 shillings if I went down the tunnel. Just had to unlock a door. Said it was for a church surprise. Who was it? The boy's eyes flicked up, and for the first time they were afraid. Not just wary, truly afraid. "Reverend Markham," he whispered. We left the cottage in silence, though Holmes's expression had grown darker by the step. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows through the crooked headstones. I could see he was assembling something, quietly, internally, placing the last corners of a puzzle we had only glimpsed at the beginning. "He used the boy to gain access," Holmes murmured, "because he knew Merrow suspected him." I frowned. But why would Markham need to disappear the vicar at all? "To inherit the inheritance," Holmes said. "Through Eliza." I stopped walking. She was helping him. Holmes turned, his gaze sharp. Or he made her believe that he loved her. I felt a chill pass through me. She's nearly 10 years older. "That matters little to a man playing the long game," Holmes said. "If he seduced her, if he convinced her that together they could reclaim her ancestral home, then he had motive, means, and the perfect pawn." He paused, then added, "But it was never about love. It was about control. Once Merrow vanished, Markham could quietly influence Eliza, guide her hand. He could appear the gallant protector, all while removing the one man who stood between him and the deed." "And the crypt?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "It was his stage, a vanishing act in 2 parts, first Merrow, then me." I stared at him. "You allowed him to trap you. I needed to know how far he would go." That evening we returned to the rectory. Eliza Merrow answered the door, her face pale and drawn. "He's not here," she said softly. "He left just after Vespers. Said he needed air." "Miss Merrow," Holmes said gently, "do you love him?" Her eyes widened. What? "Markham, do you love him?" She stared at him for a moment, then looked away. "I thought I did," she whispered, "but now I don't know. He's been distant, cold even. After Timothy vanished, he kept saying how the Lord moves in mysterious ways, how perhaps my brother's departure was a sign." "And did he ever mention the Ashcombe lands?" Her face changed, flinched almost. "Yes, just once. Said it would be poetic if they came back into the family." Holmes stepped closer. "He played you, Miss Merrow, as surely as he played Henry. He used your grief, your trust, and your silence. But it ends tonight." She looked up, tears brimming. "Is Timothy alive?" "I believe so," Holmes said. "But for how much longer depends on how quickly we act." At 8:30 that night, a constable stationed outside the church spotted movement near the rectory. He called out, but the figure darted back, toward the church. Moments later, he found the vestry door ajar. We arrived within minutes, lanterns drawn. Holmes led the charge down the pulpit stair, through the crypt, into the narrow passage where the faint scent of damp linen lingered. The tunnel stretched long and dark, but the footprints were fresh this time. Wet, recent. "He's down here," Holmes murmured, and indeed he was. in the far corner of the second chamber, chained to a beam, half conscious, his robes tattered and face ashen, lay Reverend Timothy Merrow. Holmes knelt beside him instantly. "Watson!" I crouched and began checking his pulse. Alive. Weak, but alive. Holmes's gaze swept the room. He was drugged, moved, hidden here while Markham built his fable. A shadow crossed the threshold. We turned to see Reverend Markham standing in the passage, a lantern in one hand and something gleaming in the other. He looked calm. "Hollow, weren't supposed to come back," he said to Holmes. Holmes rose slowly. "You weren't supposed to betray a man you called your friend," he said. Markham's hand tightened around the blade. Holmes didn't flinch. "Drop it!" Lestrade barked from behind, stepping into the tunnel with his revolver drawn. Markham hesitated, then did. The blade clattered to the floor, and with it, the last illusion. Chapter 9. The Final Confession. The cell at the Dunstable Constabulary was small, its only window covered with rusted bars and a weather-stained shutter that never quite closed. Reverend Markham sat in the corner, his head bowed, a Bible resting, untouched on the cot beside him. Lestrade stood just outside the door, arms crossed, the brim of his bowler hat lowered to shadow his face. "He hasn't said a word since you brought him in," Lestrade muttered. "Refused food, barely even blinked." Holmes was motionless, his gaze fixed on the cell door. "He'll speak," he said quietly. "Not out of guilt, out of pride." I looked up from my seat beside the constable's desk. "Pride?" Holmes nodded. "Men like Markham cannot abide being misunderstood. He believes his actions were justified, that he was clever enough to conceal it all. But now that the lie has been ripped open, he will need to narrate his own version of the truth." At that moment, the door creaked open and Eliza Merrow entered, accompanied by Mrs. Lamble. Eliza's face was pale but composed. Her gloves trembled slightly in her hands. "I want to hear it," she said. Holmes turned. "Are you sure?" "I must." He gave a short nod and addressed the constable. "Unlock the door. Keep the bolts unlatched, but stand ready." Markham looked up as the door opened, his eyes flicking first to Holmes, then to Eliza. For a long moment no one spoke. Finally Markham said, "I never meant for it to end like this." His voice was calm, measured even, not remorseful. Eliza stepped closer, her voice quiet but cold. "You lied to me." He bowed his head. Holmes sat on the opposite bench, steepling his fingers. "You may as well begin, Reverend. The stage is yours." Markham smiled faintly at the irony. "You always had a flair for theatre, Mr. Holmes." He looked toward Eliza, then away. "I found the deed by accident. Timothy had left his safe unlocked. I was searching for something else. I knew immediately what it was. A chance. A future." He exhaled slowly. The Ashcombe lands were vast, rich. But more than that, they were yours, Eliza. You had been wronged. It wasn't fair. And yet no one had done a thing. "Told me," she whispered, "that it was history, that my brother had let it go." And he had. But that didn't mean you should. She took a trembling breath, but said nothing. Markham's tone changed, almost dreamy now. "I believed we could take it back. Legally, quietly. I convinced myself I loved you, that we could marry, reclaim the estate, begin again, but Timothy, he wouldn't agree. He said the past should remain buried. So you buried him? Holmes asked. No, Markham snapped. I didn't kill him. I couldn't. I meant only to frighten him, to make him disappear long enough for the papers to be processed. I told Henry to open the tunnel. I lured Timothy into the pulpit under the pretense of confession. His voice faltered, but when I showed him the deed, he wasn't angry. He was sad. He said none of it mattered to him anymore. That land and legacy were poisons in different bottles. He looked up, his eyes suddenly shining. And yet, when I told him I would pursue it on your behalf, Eliza, he said he would destroy the deed. There was silence. I panicked, Markham whispered. I dosed his tea, just a small amount, enough to disorient him. He collapsed during evensong. I carried him down the tunnel with Henry's help. I swore to keep him there only a few days, until the transfer was complete. But you never filed the papers, Holmes said quietly. Markham shook his head. Because by the time I was ready, you had arrived and I knew the game was up. Eliza turned from him, her shoulders shaking, not with sobs, but with controlled, quiet fury. You used me, she said, and you disgraced my brother. I protected you, Markham said, almost desperately. I did all of it, for you. She looked over her shoulder, and her voice was ice. You did it for yourself. Outside the cell, Holmes and I walked beneath the soft drizzle that had begun to fall, the lamps of the high street casting silver reflections onto the wet stone. He will stand trial, I presume? I asked. Yes, Holmes said. He has confessed to unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, and fraud. Likely enough to see him spend many years reflecting in solitude. And Reverend Merrow? He's recovering, Holmes said. Slowly, but I suspect he will never return to Dunstable. Some kinds of betrayal are more corrosive than any poison. We paused before the darkened churchyard, the wind rustling through the yews. Do you think Eliza knew? I asked. Holmes tilted his head. No, but I think she suspected, deep down, beneath the flattery and the charm, that she was being courted by ambition, not affection. Her silence, I believe, was the price she paid to believe otherwise. He turned to me then, a rare solemnity in his voice. Watson, this was never truly a case about disappearance. It was a case about erasure, of legacy, of conscience, of inconvenient truths. The crypt was not merely a hiding place, but a metaphor, a place where secrets are meant to sleep forever. We walked on in silence. Behind us, the bells of St. Sed's began to toll again, not in alarm, but in ceremony, a reminder that life, however fragile and fractured, still moved forward beneath the grey skies of England. Chapter 10. The Final Gathering. The next evening the vestry of St. Sed's was lit with a sombre amber glow. Rain whispered at the stained glass. Windows and the scent of candle wax mingled with damp stone. It was in this solemn chamber, beneath portraits of rectors long dead, that Sherlock Holmes requested one final meeting. Those summoned arrived just after dusk, each one stepping through the heavy wooden door with a hesitation born of recent events. Eliza Merrow entered first, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. Behind her came Mrs. Agnes Lamble, her face pale but resolute. Mr. Percival Ames followed, dry legal folders clutched in one arm, his collar askew and spectacles fogged by the weather. Even the boy, Henry Partridge, was there, silent, fidgeting, eyes darting from face to face with the nervous energy of someone who had seen too much and understood only half of it. Lestrade stood to the side, arms folded, while I took a seat near the ledger cabinet. Holmes, of course, remained standing. He faced them all with the quiet command of a man not seeking attention, but possessing it entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for coming. As you know, Reverend Timothy Merrow has been rescued and is now in the care of physicians. His health is fragile, but his mind is intact. I have no doubt he will soon testify to the full extent of what occurred. Yet, for the benefit of clarity and closure, I have gathered you here to explain precisely how and why he disappeared." There was a murmur of shifting fabric, the creak of chairs as backs straightened. Holmes's voice remained even. The crime was not murder, though it flirted with the idea. It was a deception, a carefully staged vanishing act, a blend of ambition, betrayal, and suppressed history. His eyes moved slowly across the group. To understand it fully, we must begin not with the Reverend, but with the land, the Ashcombe estate. Mr. Ames adjusted his glasses. "That matter is still under legal review." Holmes held up a hand, and will remain so. "But what matters is that the Ashcombe estate was passed improperly into Crown hands in 1854, following the disappearance of a legal deed. That deed, as you now know, was recently found, hidden beneath the church floor." He paused, "but not by chance. It was found by Reverend Merrow, who, it seems, had reason to believe it still existed." At this, Eliza's hands tightened slightly, in her lap. "He discovered it weeks before his disappearance," Holmes continued, "and in doing so, became a threat to another's plan." He turned to the boy. "Henry." The lad flinched. "You were approached by someone who offered you money in exchange for access to the church tunnels. Who was it?" Henry glanced toward Eliza, then Mrs. Lamble, then down at the floor. "It was the curate," he mumbled. "Markham." Holmes gave a slow nod. Reverend Markham learned of the deed and realized it posed both a danger and an opportunity. With the vicar's blessing, it would change the ownership of Ashcombe entirely, placing it legally into the hands of the Merrow family. But with the vicar removed and Eliza guided into filing the claim, Markham could stand beside her as husband, adviser, and eventual inheritor. A stunned silence followed. Holmes went on. It was not merely a plot of land. It was a vision of control. Markham wished to secure his future. To do so, he needed Merrow gone, but not dead. A corpse would bring inquiry. A disappearance could be passed off as stress, divine calling, or madness. Holmes's tone darkened, and so he used the boy to unlock the tunnel. He drugged the Reverend's tea with laudanum, enough to render him unconscious, and hid him in a chamber beneath the crypt. A space that, had I not suspected it, might have served indefinitely as a tomb without a body. Henry swallowed hard. Eliza's face had gone pale. But, Holmes continued, Markham made one error. He staged the event too well. The lamps flickering, the pulpit seemingly swallowing the reverend whole. He wanted witnesses, wanted the mystery. Because the more impossible the disappearance appeared, the less inclined we would be to search for logic. He stepped toward the window, letting the silence stretch just long enough to draw in every breath of the room. Then, Holmes said, he grew greedy, or perhaps frightened. When I began investigating the tunnels, he saw an opportunity, a second vanishing. If Holmes could disappear as well, the legend would solidify. But of course... Here he turned back with the faintest hint of a smile. I vanished on my terms. I nodded, recalling the faint smirk on Holmes's face as we emerged from that cold stone corridor to find Markham's plan unravelling. Lestrade stepped forward now. "And Miss Merrow?" he asked. "Did she know?" Holmes looked at her carefully. "No," he said. "She was a victim, as her brother was. Markham manipulated her grief, fed her hope, promised her justice for an injustice that had long festered. But in the end, he saw her only as the key to a door he could not open alone." Eliza's eyes were shining. She said nothing. Holmes's voice softened. "We are all capable of blindness when pain distorts the past, but what matters is how we respond once the light returns." There was a long silence then, broken only by the faint hiss of rain on the vestry roof. Mrs. Lamble spoke next, her voice low. "Will Reverend Merrow recover?" Holmes nodded. "He has already begun to. I believe he'll leave Dunstable, but not before naming his successor, and making certain the church records are amended to include the Ashcombe deed." Mr. Ames, for once, looked deeply moved. Then, "The land will go to its rightful heir," Holmes said, "and whatever Miss Merrow chooses to do with it shall be hers to decide." Eliza looked up. "I shall keep it," she said simply, "but I shall never live there." Holmes bowed, his head slightly, "As you wish." Later that night, as the vestry lights dimmed and the guests departed, Holmes and I remained a moment longer in the empty church. The candle flames flickered in the shadows, and outside the storm had settled into a soft drizzle. "You handled it gently," I said. "I am not always so sharp-edged," Holmes replied. "Some truths deserve to be folded rather than thrown." He reached into his coat and removed the pewter button, the one I had noticed him pocket in the tunnel. "From the old vestments," he said, "left behind decades ago, from when the Ashcombe heir was last buried here. It reminded me that the past is not always gone. Sometimes it is simply waiting to be seen again." I smiled. "You're becoming philosophical. Too much time among the tombs, perhaps." He turned to the door. "Come, Watson. The dead have said their piece. Let us return to the land of the living." Chapter 11. The unravelling. We returned to the drawing-room of the Rose and Wren that evening, the fire crackling quietly in the grate, the rain now a whisper against the window-panes. It was, as Holmes often said, the proper time for unravelling, a case not before the final breath of tension had left the air, and not before all the actors had made their final unconscious confessions. Lestrade sat opposite Holmes, his boots steaming slightly, and I took the armchair nearest the hearth, pen in hand and notebook ready. Holmes sat quietly for a time, one leg folded over the other, his fingertips pressed together in contemplation. "There is a moment," he began, "in every mystery when the illusion must be acknowledged, when the curtain is lifted, and the conjurer revealed not as a magician, but as a man of tricks." He leaned forward. "In this case, The conjurer was Reverend Jonathan Markham. The illusion was the vanishing of Reverend Timothy Merrow. "Let us begin at the beginning," Holmes said. Timothy Merrow discovered the hidden deed, a document long buried in the church's crypt, affirming the Merrow family's legal claim to the Ashcombe estate. He confided in no one, perhaps not even his sister. But Markham learned of it. Whether by observation or accident, he realized that with the vicar gone, Eliza would be sole heir. If Markham could influence her, or better yet, marry her, he could, by extension, control the estate. I nodded, a motive rooted in property, not passion. "Precisely," Holmes said. Markham set his plan in motion with methodical patience. He had already discovered the pulpit's hidden passage. Whether during repairs or through his own snooping, he knew of the ancient tunnel system that led to an unused chamber, accessible only through the crypt, and difficult to reach unnoticed. "And he used the boy," Lestrade added. "Yes," Holmes agreed. "Henry Partridge, young, impressionable, eager for coin. Markham convinced him to open the tunnel, perhaps even to help lower the sedated vicar into the crypt chamber. The boy was told it was a harmless errand, a game. Markham likely threatened him into silence afterwards. He stood and paced slowly before the hearth. The timing was critical. The incident occurred just after evensong. The lamps flickered because Markham manipulated the gas tap in the vestry, creating the illusion of a divine or supernatural disappearance. It was sleight of hand, nothing more." "And no one questioned the logistics?" I asked. "Of course not," Holmes said with a slight smile, "because Markham ensured the drama was sufficient to prevent scrutiny. Witnesses do not analyze. They remember emotions, not facts. Fear or confusion, all are tools of misdirection." Lestrade frowned. "But why not just kill the vicar? Less trouble." Holmes's face grew serious. "Murder is messy. It breeds suspicion. A disappearance, especially one with the air of mystery and sanctity, stalls inquiries. Markham hoped the longer Merrow remained missing, the more the village would lean into legend rather than law. He could then encourage Eliza to step forward, file the deed and assume the estate. If necessary, he could marry her, consolidating the claim. "And if she refused?" I asked. "He would still have the documents," Holmes replied. "He could forge a signature if he dared, but he gambled that Eliza's grief would make her pliable, and for a time it did." He returned to his seat and rested his chin on one hand. But he made errors. The note left in my own room, intended to warn me away, was too calculated. The flickering of the lamps during my stage disappearance mirrored Merrow's far too precisely. I suspected immediately that I was being baited into a trap meant to mirror the original Vanishing. And so I used the moment to descend voluntarily into the tunnels. "You let him believe he had fooled you," I said. "Indeed," Holmes nodded, "and in doing so, I found not only the hidden chamber, but also the truth. Reverend Merrow, still alive, weakened but unbroken, and the documents intact." At this point Lestrade sat forward, arms on his knees. "So, what finally gave him away?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Two things. First, Mrs. Lamble's testimony. She saw Markham near the pulpit the night before Merrow vanished, and Markham lied about it. Second, The pewter button I retrieved from the tunnel floor. He opened his hand and displayed the object, plain, tarnished, but unmistakably old. This button matched one described in a church inventory from 1868, part of the Ashcombe family's ceremonial vestments. Someone had worn them in that tunnel once before. History has a way of repeating itself. First to bury the deed, now to retrieve it. Holmes returned the button to his pocket. But the final clue, he said softly, was psychological. We both looked at him. Markham was a man of scripture. He quoted it excessively, used it as armour. But during our last confrontation, when I referenced the book of Isaiah, he did not correct me when I misquoted. I frowned. So, Holmes smiled, because the real Markham always corrected biblical misquotation. His silence meant his mind was elsewhere. Desperate. He was unravelling even then. The fire crackled. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lestrade sighed. "Well, Holmes, you've tied it all neatly. And Dunstable can sleep a little easier." Holmes's face, however, remained thoughtful. "Not all endings are neat, Inspector. The vicar may recover, but he will carry a wound deeper than laudanum or stone walls. And Miss Merrow, she must live with the knowledge that someone used her love to build a prison." "And what of the boy?" I asked. Holmes looked to the window. "I have already spoken with the magistrate. Henry Partridge will not be prosecuted. He was a pawn, not a player. I believe he has a chance at redemption, perhaps even a future." Sat a little longer. The room hushed and golden. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds at last, casting a pale beam through the misted glass. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his voice quieter now. "It is always the same," he said. "A man believes himself above consequence. He builds his world on deception, on vanity. And then one morning the truth knocks, and the house he's built folds like paper." He closed his eyes. "And yet," he added, "it never ceases to fascinate me." Chapter 12. Outcome and Justice. Spring had begun to creep into Dunstable by the time the court reached its judgment. The trees along the edge of the village had traded their grey austerity for faint whispers of green, and the morning air smelled of wet stone and wood smoke, tinged now and again by the tentative scent of crocuses nudging through the soil. Life in the village, so recently upended, had begun to stitch itself together again. Tea resumed at 4:15. The baker's bell rang daily, and pews at St. Sed's were once again filled with voices in prayer. But though the surface had smoothed, the undercurrent of what had happened remained, and justice, in its own slow way, had arrived. Reverend Jonathan Markham was sentenced to 10 years at Dartmoor Prison. The official charges read, unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. The judge, a narrow-shouldered man with rheumy eyes, had described the case as an elaborate and morally repugnant act of betrayal, conducted under the guise of spiritual trust. Markham, for his part, had remained composed during the sentencing, his gaze cool, unmoved. But Holmes noted one telling detail. "He never looked at Eliza," he said as we left the courtroom. "Not once." Miss Merrow had not spoken publicly since the arrest. She had declined all invitations to speak at church gatherings and had sent only a single handwritten letter to the parish announcing her formal withdrawal from any claims to the Ashcombe estate. Holmes and I visited her on a grey afternoon at a small cottage nestled behind a wisteria-covered wall near the edge of the downs. She greeted us warmly, if with the poise of someone who had walked through fire and was now learning how to breathe. "Again, I'll not be leaving Dunstable," she told us as she poured the tea. "This is still my home, but the land, the estate, those were never truly mine. They belonged to my ancestors, to history, not to me." "You could still claim them, legally," I said gently. She shook her head. "What good is land when it has soaked up so much sorrow? Let it rest. Let others do something better with it than we did." Holmes nodded once. "That is wisdom, Miss Merrow, not defeat." She smiled faintly. "I learned it from watching someone who listens more than he speaks. As for Reverend Timothy Merrow, he made his recovery quietly and steadily. It was weeks before he was strong enough to leave his temporary care in London. But when he did, he returned not to the pulpit, but to a small mission in the north, where he devoted himself to restoring crumbling churches and mentoring troubled young clergy. He sent a single note to Holmes by post. "I owe you my freedom, and perhaps more than that, my clarity. Some chains are not made of iron, but expectation. I am grateful to be free of both. May our paths cross again in peace." Holmes read it aloud, then tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat. "No signature," he noted, "but much said. Remained in Dunstable just long enough to see the village exhale. Henry Partridge was taken under the care of a kind widow who lived just outside town. Mrs. Greaves, a retired schoolmistress with no children of her own, but a stubborn insistence on the virtues of discipline and poetry. "He's clever, that one," she said, pinching his ear as he tried to slink out of view during our visit. "Clever and fast, the kind that gets lost unless someone nails their shoes down." Holmes gave her a rare smile. "Then I'm glad he's in your hands, madam." The boy looked up at Holmes then, uncertain, perhaps even ashamed. "Sorry," he mumbled, "for the notes, for the lies." Holmes crouched beside him, eye to eye. "You made mistakes," he said, "but you didn't make the plan. You were made part of it." Henry nodded. "Still." "Still," Holmes echoed. "You now have the rest of your life to do something better." The boy didn't reply, but he didn't look away either. That, Holmes told me later, was enough. On our final morning in the village, I found Holmes standing alone in the graveyard behind St. Sed's, his overcoat dark against the pale mist. He stood before a headstone that bore no name, just a simple carving of a lamb beneath a tree. I approached quietly. "I didn't know you were sentimental," I said. He didn't turn. "I'm not." After a moment he added, "It belonged to a child who died during the cholera outbreak of 1853. The vicar's records say she was buried with no family, no ceremony, just a pewter button from her father's coat, stitched inside the hem of her dress." I glanced down at the small stone. "The same kind of button you found in the crypt?" Holmes nodded. "This land has always carried the weight of forgetting. But buried truth has a habit of pushing to the surface." He stepped back, brushing the moisture from his gloves. "And someone must be there to recognize it when it does." That evening, as our train pulled away from Dunstable station, I looked back at the village once more. The steeple of St. Sed's stood stark against the fading sky, its bells still, its secrets finally spent. for now." Holmes sat with his coat folded over his arm, his eyes distant but alert. "You knew Markham would fail," I said. "I knew he was clever," Holmes replied, "but clever men often rely too much on illusion. He believed misdirection would save him." "And it almost did." "Yes," Holmes said, "almost." He looked out the window, the countryside slipping past. But even the best illusion cannot hold forever beneath the light of observation. Truth has its own gravity, Watson. Eventually, it pulls everything back into view. Chapter 13. A Soul in Chains. The early days of April brought a reluctant thaw to Dunstable. Frost still clung to hedgerows in the morning, but lambs bleated in the distance, and the occasional blossom pushed its way through the chilled soil, defying memory and melancholy alike. Holmes and I remained in the village longer than expected, not for lack of resolve, but due to the fragile state of Reverend Merrow, who had requested, through the solicitor Ames, a private audience with Holmes. It was on a pale Tuesday morning that we returned to the rectory. Holmes ahead of me, carrying only his walking stick and a small leather-bound volume beneath one arm. Merrow, swaddled in layers of wool and seated near the window, looked more like a shadow than a man. Yet his eyes were clear. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "thank you for coming, and for finding me before I became less than a man." Holmes inclined his head but said nothing. There was a long pause before the vicar spoke again. "Do you know what it is to forgive someone who has attempted to unmake you?" Holmes's brow furrowed. "Forgiveness is not among my strengths, Reverend." "I once believed it wasn't among mine," Merrow said. "But in the silence of that stone chamber, I remembered every act of kindness Markham ever gave me. Every moment he seemed sincere." He looked up. "I want to believe he was once." Holmes regarded him for a moment, then stepped forward and handed him the volume. It was the church's copy of the Book of Common Prayer. Not Merrow's original, but one from the vestry shelves. Inside was a note in Holmes's precise, slanted hand. "If a man shall walk in darkness, and hath no light, let him trust in the name of the Lord, and stay upon his God." Isaiah 50:10. Merrow read it and gave a faint, weary smile. "I thought you did not quote Scripture." "I don't," Holmes said, turning to the window. "But I remember when others do." Outside the rectory, the wind had begun to pick up. Holmes paused, pulling on his gloves. "He will never return to the pulpit," he said. "Can you blame him?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied, "but I wonder if he blames himself. Men of faith often do. They carry others' sins as if they were their own." We passed the garden gate where Eliza had once stood awaiting news of her brother. Now her windows remained shuttered, and the house had taken on the lonely air of places that have outlived their purpose. "She's gone?" I asked. "Gone north," Holmes confirmed, "to stay with distant cousins in Surrey. Left a note for Mrs. Lamble. No address." "Do you think she'll return?" "No, nor should she. Some soil is too salted for growth." That evening, as we dined at the inn, Holmes grew unusually contemplative. "Watson," he said, "do you ever wonder what becomes of those left behind after a case?" I looked up from my supper. "All the time." Holmes nodded slowly. "We returned to Baker Street. The world resumes its familiar rhythm. But here, he gestured faintly toward the window and the village beyond. Lives have been altered, not by violence, not by death, but by deceit. There's a cruelty in that quieter form of damage. I saw the shadows beneath his eyes, and for once I didn't argue. I wonder, he added, if we'll see Markham again. You think he might escape? No. But men like him don't vanish in cells. They transform. They write letters. They preach to walls. Sometimes they even convince the world they were wronged. He stood and retrieved his coat. Justice, Watson, is never as permanent as we would like. Later that night, as I was preparing for bed, a knock came at the door. It was Henry Partridge. He looked awkward in his ill-fitting coat, cheeks red from the wind. "Sorry to come so late," he mumbled. I just wanted to ask about the vicar." "Reverend Merrow?" I asked. "He's recovering." The boy's eyes dropped. "Not him, the other one." Holmes appeared behind me, silent as smoke. "You wish to know if Markham will forgive you." Henry didn't respond. "You didn't destroy anything, Henry," Holmes said softly. "You were used, but forgiveness will come not from Markham, nor from me. It will come from the way you choose to live after." Henry hesitated. "I want to be good." Holmes placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Then begin with the truth, and speak it, even when no one asks." The boy nodded and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Holmes and I stood at the edge of Dunstable's village square, the wind tugging at our collars as a distant bell rang out the hour. "Duh, case isn't finished, is it?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Not yet." I raised an eyebrow. "Then what remains?" Holmes turned, his eyes fixed toward the far hills. "The paper trail, Watson. There are whispers in London already of a trustee in the Ashcombe estate who might have known the deed was missing all along, of a solicitor who delayed processing inheritance filings on purpose. You suspect more players. I suspect Markham was only part of the machinery." He paused, "and I intend to follow the gears." Chapter 14. The Ashcombe Connection. The train ride back to London was a quiet one. Holmes sat hunched in thought, eyes half closed beneath the brim of his hat, fingers twitching faintly with imagined motion, as if conducting invisible threads in his mind. I recognized the state. His brain, having sifted through the dust of Dunstable, was now turning its gaze outward, searching for the invisible links that would tether one act of deception to a broader web. "You believe someone else knew about the deed?" I finally asked. Holmes opened one eye. "I know someone else did. No man stages a vanishing without some sense that the world will forget to follow." He drew from his coat a folded page, a copy of a property register from the Crown Lands Office, stamped and dated. I noted the name signed at the bottom. "Edward Blythe Swan," I read aloud. "Senior Estate Solicitor." Holmes nodded, and a man with his hands in nearly every contested parcel of land between Bedfordshire and Sussex. He certified the missing status of the Ashcombe deed 15 years ago, and conveniently he was never pressed for verification. I frowned. "Are you suggesting Markham and Blythe Swan conspired together?" "Not directly," Holmes said, but Blythe Swan may have created the silence that Markham used to stage his scheme. He tapped the document once, and if Blythe Swan did so knowingly, then the fraud did not begin in Dunstable. It began in London. We arrived at Chancery Lane just after midday. The offices of Blythe and Penham were housed in a tall, narrow building, sandstone and iron, with windows that seemed to blink rather than shine. The door bore a polished brass plaque and a suspiciously new coat of paint. Inside, the air smelled of old wool, lamp oil, and something faintly chemical. A clerk, pale and distracted, ushered us toward a small receiving room after only a glance at Holmes's calling card. Within minutes, a man emerged. He was lean and silver-haired, dressed in a frock coat that managed to be both understated and expensive. His eyes, however, were small and shrewd. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a tone that balanced courtesy and calculation. "A surprise? What can I do for you?" Holmes rose, but did not offer his hand. "I'm inquiring about the Ashcombe estate, specifically a deed certified as lost in 1892. Blythe Swan's face didn't change. "And?" Holmes withdrew a small envelope from his breast pocket and passed it to him. Inside were photographs, images of the deed itself, of the Ashcombe crest, and the seal once presumed broken. Blythe Swan flipped through them with professional ease. "I see," he said. "Then it's been found." "It was never lost," Holmes replied, "only hidden." "Then I suggest you speak to the party who hid it." "I have," Holmes said calmly, "but I find it more curious that your office never once followed up. No certified inquiry, no attempted retrieval from local records. You declared the deed missing with astonishing efficiency." For a moment, silence stretched. Then Blythe Swan offered a faint smile. There was no legal requirement to retrieve the deed if the inheritor, Timothy Merrow, had not filed intent to claim. "You see, Mr. Holmes, sometimes the law does not concern itself with shadows. If no one contests the silence becomes fact." Holmes stared at him. "And yet your firm processed the temporary holding lease on the Ashcombe farmland. Last year you stood to gain from the land being unclaimed." Blythe Swan didn't blink. "We acted under instruction. Government leases, Crown policy." "No doubt," Holmes murmured. "But how fortunate that Markham's sudden interest in the land aligned with a period of filing delays from your office." Blythe Swan straightened. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Not yet," Holmes replied. "But I am curious whether your other files hold similar cases. Lands marked missing, families forgotten, paper trails quietly redirected." He took a slow step forward. "The law may not concern itself with shadows, Mr. Blythe Swan, but I do." We left the office shortly after, Holmes carrying nothing but a fresh slip of notepaper and a name, Samuel Ardwick, junior solicitor, formerly of Blythe and Penham, dismissed abruptly in 1892 for clerical irregularities. "He made the original discovery," Holmes said as we stepped into a hansom cab. "I'd wager he logged the Ashcombe deed as present, and someone had him removed to alter the file. Do you think he'll speak to you now?" "If he hasn't disappeared like the deed," Holmes said dryly. We found Ardwick living in a boarding house in Hammersmith. His quarters modest, his clothes worn. He answered the door himself, a man in his late 40s with wind-blown hair and a gaze that flicked nervously at the sight of Holmes. "I told them I did my duty," he said, before Holmes even introduced himself. "I logged the document, sealed it in the Dunstable ledger. I even sent the Crown notice of its existence." "And then you were dismissed," Holmes finished. "Not fired," Ardwick said bitterly. "Transferred to the Rural Holdings Office in Gloucestershire, filing leases for peat bogs and railway verge. I tried to protest, but Blythe said the deed was immaterial." "Did Markham ever contact you?" "Never," Ardwick said. "But someone did 2 years later. A man named Rowntree offered me a finder's fee if I could produce the Ashcombe deed." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And you refused?" "I did more than refuse," Ardwick said. "I hid my copy of the ledger, took it with me when I left." He disappeared into a back room and returned with a satchel. Inside, a single yellowing book. Holmes opened it, and there it was, Ashcombe, Estate, Title C423, filed and confirmed, August 1892, witnessed by S. Ardwick. Condition excellent. Seal intact. Below that, a second line in faded pencil. Transfer request denied. Crown Holding maintained order filed. September 1892. Initialed EBS. Holmes exhaled softly. "They buried it," he said, quietly, cleanly, and permanently. The lamps of London began to flicker to life against the early evening sky. Holmes and I made our way back to Baker Street. The satchel lay at Holmes's feet. I said nothing for a long while, until he finally broke the silence. "This was never about Markham alone," he said. "It was a system, a machine that learned how to erase people on paper first, and in person only if necessary." "And now?" I asked. "Now," Holmes said, "we shine a light on the ledger." Chapter 15. Beneath the Seal. The morning after our meeting with Samuel Ardwick, Holmes awoke at an uncharacteristically late hour. I found him seated at the breakfast table in his dressing gown, the untouched toast cooling on its plate, his gaze distant but crystalline with clarity. "The signature on the order to suppress the Ashcombe deed," he said without preamble, "was Blythe Swan's, yes, but the initials on the transfer denial were not." He tapped the margin of Ardwick's ledger with a long forefinger. "EBS, and below that a fainter mark, partially erased. A second hand was involved, one who had the authority to bury the record, but lacked the nerve to do it cleanly." Looked closer. "So who?" Holmes stood. "It's time we visited the Records Office at Whitehall." The Ministry of Land Grants and Historical Holdings occupied a cold marbled structure off Whitehall's main thoroughfare. It was a building where time clung to the walls like mildew, and where silence wasn't just observed, it was enforced. Holmes led the way to a discreet corner office overseen by a Miss Carrington, a middle-aged archivist with sharp spectacles, and a voice like parchment rustling in wind. "We're seeking access to estate document logs filed under Ashcombe Parish between the years 1880 and 1895, Holmes said. Specifically any entries concerning reallocation, suppression, or errata." Miss Carrington peered at him. "Solicitor?" Holmes handed her a forged letterhead from the fictitious office of Langley and Strand, one of his more recent creations. Carrington squinted, then nodded. "Follow me." We passed shelves stacked with ledgers as wide as tombstones. The smell of dust, old ink and wax was nearly suffocating. Carrington pulled a thin black volume from a locked cabinet, blew the dust from its spine and placed it before Holmes. "Anything altered is marked in red," she said. "Be quick, you've 15 minutes." Holmes flipped pages rapidly, his gaze sweeping like a hawk in flight. Then suddenly he stopped. "There," he said. I leaned over. The entry read, "Ashcombe Holding, Bedfordshire Original Deed filed, C423, August 1892. Contested. Order for reclassification, September 3rd, 1892. Beneath that, in a lighter hand, access suspended, pending verification by senior counsel. Refer case to L. Addington." "Addington," I echoed. "Lawrence Addington," Holmes said softly. "Senior legal counsel to the ministry in 1892. Later knighted, died in 1901, but—" his eyes narrowed. Before that, he chaired the Land Claim Audit Board. He had the authority to freeze or erase property claims. And if he ordered Ashcombe buried, then Blythe Swan was merely the pen. Addington was the hand. Holmes turned the page. There, tucked beneath a clipped memorandum, was a red ink annotation. "Concerns over deed authenticity unfounded. Claim delay advised until disposition of beneficiary. Do not notify party of interest. L.A." "Good God," I whispered. They knew it was valid. And they withheld it deliberately. Holmes snapped the ledger shut. They manufactured ambiguity, because ambiguity allowed them to keep the land. Back on the street, Holmes was brimming with a rare kind of intensity. Quiet, cold, but unmistakably alive. "They turned a deed into purgatory, Watson. Neither lost nor processed. A permanent placeholder. And in doing so, they allowed others, like Markham, to exploit the vacuum." "But Addington's dead," I reminded him. Holmes nodded, "which is why we must find who inherited his files, and who has since ensured this strategy continued under the ministry's nose." That trail led us, curiously enough, to Langham House, a private residence-turned-law library on the edge of Knightsbridge. The property belonged to Addington's estate and had been inherited by his great-nephew, a quiet solicitor named Edmund Tewkesbury. We arrived to find the man hunched over a desk in the front parlour, sorting through yellowing papers. "Mr. Tewkesbury?" Holmes asked. The man blinked at us through round spectacles. "Yes?" Holmes introduced himself, this time truthfully. Tewkesbury stiffened. "My uncle's estate has been closed for years. All records were transferred to the University of Exeter archives." "Except," Holmes said, "for the private ledgers." Tewkesbury froze. "We're not here for a prosecution." Holmes continued. "We're here for the pattern." Slowly, the younger man nodded. He kept a series of private journals, kept meticulous notes about which lands were frozen, which were reclassified, and who could be trusted to delay the truth. He disappeared into a side room and returned with a slim red volume. Its spine bore a single word, handwritten in gold packs. Holmes flipped it open and scanned quickly. Then he stopped. "Here," he murmured. The page was dated August 1892. It read, "Ashcombe to remain dormant. Key is silence. Markham has eyes on the parish. A valuable ally in future. Will delay file until brother loses inheritance or converts." Holmes looked up sharply. Brother? Tewkesbury nodded. Timothy Merrow had an elder brother. Died in a train accident in India in 1884. No surviving heirs. But Addington believed the family line might shift again. Holmes said slowly. And Markham was already circling. As we left the house, dusk settling over the chimneys of Knightsbridge, Holmes was quiet for several blocks. Then he said, "They Geschädigte weren't just delaying claims. They were curating inheritance, picking and choosing heirs, silencing those with weak voices and rewarding those with obedience. And Merrow? Didn't fit the mould," Holmes said. "Too principled, too aware. So they buried the land and let men like Markham keep the ghosts in their pockets." He glanced toward the evening sky. "But now the ghosts are walking. Watson." Chapter 16. The Return to Dunstable. The train steamed steadily northward again, the smoke curling behind us like the remnants of burnt secrets. Holmes sat silently, his fingers laced together beneath his chin, his gaze fixed out the window. Outside, the English countryside blurred past in gentle greens and greys, hedgerows, fields, distant trees nodding in a wind that whispered of storms long past. The satchel at Holmes's feet contained the Addington ledger, the ministry annotations, and the file from Ardwick's satchel. Together they formed a paper trail of elegant corruption, a record of property manipulation carried out in silence, far from the glare of any courtroom or press office. "Do you intend to bring this to Scotland Yard?" I asked quietly. "No," Holmes replied. "Not yet." His voice was calm, almost measured. But I recognized the underlying current of intent. We had passed the realm of deduction now, and were firmly in that of consequence. "This ends where it began," he said, "in Dunstable." We arrived on a cloudy afternoon, the village looking little changed, yet subtly altered. The streets felt quieter, the houses more watchful. The bells of St. Sed's rang in a minor key, or so it seemed to me. Mrs. Lamble met us near the market square, her face pinched with concern. "He's back," she whispered. "Markham." Holmes's brow lifted. "Here. In custody," she clarified. "The police brought him up to stand for the formal estate inquest. Next week. Apparently he's contesting some technicality." Holmes said nothing for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Where is he being held?" "The magistrate's office. But they've allowed him to speak with counsel, and, well, he's been writing." Holmes glanced at me. "They never stop playing. The game, Watson. Even when they've already lost." That evening, Holmes walked alone to the rectory. I remained behind, watching from the inn window as he passed the familiar gate and disappeared into the garden path. The light in the study flickered on an hour later, then off. When he returned, his face was unreadable. "He left notes," Holmes said simply. "Dozens. Pages written since his arrest. Letters to the Crown Solicitor, the Bishop, even the newspapers. Still trying to control the story," I said. Holmes nodded. "But there's one letter he didn't post. He handed me a sheet of paper, the writing firm, confident, almost smug. To Eliza Merrow, I was not your enemy, but your architect. I gave you a future. Your brother would have buried it in prayer. I offered you something enduring. I never meant to lose you, only to wait until you could see clearly. Perhaps when the smoke has cleared you will." Holmes exhaled sharply through his nose. He still believes himself the injured party. The next day, Holmes requested a private meeting with the regional magistrate. They met in the vestry of St. Sed's, the very place where Merrow had once vanished into shadows. Now it was filled with legal documents and the scent of musty parchment. Holmes presented the Addington ledger, Ardwick's testimony, the falsified registry notations, all laid out like a surgeon's tools. And to his credit, the magistrate listened, long and carefully. By the end of the hour, the room had shifted. "This will not stay in Dunstable," the magistrate said gravely. "This will move upward, to the ministry, perhaps even to Parliament." Holmes merely nodded. "That is where it belongs." On our final morning in the village, we stood once more in the graveyard, the sun breaking weakly through the clouds. Eliza had returned. She stood a few yards off, speaking quietly with her brother, who now walked with a cane, but carried himself with the gentle gravity of a man who had faced darkness and emerged blinking into the light. They nodded toward us. Eliza's smile was faint but real. "She'll never be the same," I murmured. "No one is," Holmes said, "after truth." We walked in silence for a while, the gravel crunching beneath our shoes. Finally, Holmes said, "It ends here, Watson." But he was wrong, because the paper trail was not yet finished. That evening, as we boarded the train for London once more, a telegram awaited Holmes at the station. He opened it without a word, then handed it to me. It read, from Ardwick. "Exeter, University Archives, found Addington's sealed correspondence, mentions 2 more estates, same pattern, will send copies, urgent." I looked at Holmes. "More? Always more," he said. The whistle blew, and the train pulled away from the platform, the village vanishing into the mist behind us. Chapter 17. Ghosts in the Archive. The telegram from Ardwick weighed heavily on Holmes's mind as we returned to London. I could see it in the way his fingers drummed the windowsill of the railway carriage, in the set of his jaw that tightened with each mile closer to the city. And in the silence, he wrapped around himself like a well-worn coat. By the time we stepped out onto the platform at Paddington, dusk had crept across the rooftops. The lamps cast long yellow columns over the platform's ironwork, and Holmes moved with the singular purpose of a man who already had the next thread between his fingers. "Exeter," he said as the cab turned southward. "Not merely an archive, but a vault of intentions. If Addington referenced other estates, then we are no longer looking at coincidence or opportunity, Watson. We are looking at pattern. And if those estates were handled in the same way as Ashcombe," I asked, "then we will prove this was never a one-off manipulation, but a system built on silence." The next morning, a parcel arrived by special courier from Samuel Ardwick. Inside were copies, some blurred, some clean, of letters written in Addington's neat, slanted hand, addressed not to lawyers or clergymen, but to unnamed recipients denoted only by initials and cipher marks. Holmes sat cross-legged on the floor of our Baker Street sitting-room, surrounded by documents. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "Delay authorization of Colebrook transfer. Heir unsuited. Await suggestion from Reverend T.D. Consider P.S. for temporary appointment." He raised his brows. "Colebrook, an estate north of Herefordshire. The original heir died in South Africa. The property was never reassigned, until 6 years later, when a lesser cousin, one Peter Sedge, miraculously produced a supporting deed. He passed the letter to me. Another silent erasure. "And this," Holmes said, reaching for a second slip of paper, "is the crown jewel." He unfolded it and laid it on the floor. It read, "March 1890. EBS to execute retrieval. Ensure no trace remains. The pattern holds. Where land outlasts its namesake, there we plant our own. This is the legacy we must protect." L.A. Holmes stood walking to the window. "You see it, don't you, Watson? The philosophy, the logic behind it. This wasn't merely greed, it was control. The shaping of England's rural estates by those who believed the country should belong to the worthy few." He turned to face me. And in the hands of men like Addington, worthiness was never a matter of law, but of preference. The remainder of the day was spent at the reading room of the British Museum, where Holmes devoured records with terrifying speed, peerage filings, probate transfers, disputed deeds. By sunset, we had a list of 6 estates that followed the same strange pattern. Original heirs declared unfit, vanished or misdirected. Replacement heirs curiously well positioned and legally unchallenged. "The web is vast," Holmes muttered, and Dunstable was only its whisper. At last he leaned back in his chair. "It's time to expose it." "To whom?" I asked. "Scotland Yard?" He shook his head. "To someone higher. Someone who can drag this rot into the light without letting it vanish into committees and footnotes." That evening, we made our way to a townhouse in Kensington. Inside, we were admitted to the private study of Sir Reginald Ashcroft, a senior parliamentary undersecretary with a reputation for ruthless discretion and a dislike of unsanctioned corruption. He listened as Holmes laid out the chain, Addington's forged silences, Blythe Swan's filing delays, Markham's opportunism, and the broader pattern of estate engineering. When Holmes finished, Ashcroft merely said, "You understand that if I bring this before a parliamentary inquiry, 6 current civil servants may fall with it." Holmes didn't blink, then let them fall. Ashcroft nodded slowly. "You have evidence?" Holmes passed him the Addington letters. "I have witnesses, Sir Reginald, and if need be, a public platform." Ashcroft gave a tight smile. "Mr. Holmes, you are not one for theatrics." "Not unless the curtains refuse to rise," Holmes said. They stared at one another for a long moment. Then Ashcroft folded the documents and stood. "I'll see to it, but be prepared. Truth, when disturbed, rarely settles quietly." On our walk back to Baker Street, Holmes was quieter than usual. "What are you thinking?" I asked him. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "I am thinking," he said, "that we have not uncovered a conspiracy, but a method. And methods are far more dangerous. They survive their creators." We paused at the corner of Gloucester Place as the gas lamps flickered to life. "And I am thinking," he added, "that the truth may not bring peace to Dunstable, or anywhere else." "But it's truth all the same," I said. "Yes," Holmes murmured, "and that, in the end, is enough." Chapter 18. The Reckoning. The morning of the inquiry dawned clear and cold. In the great chamber at Westminster, beneath tall windows and the faded banners of the Crown, a modest hearing was held. There was no public fanfare, no press gathered on the steps, and no whispered speculations trailing through the corridors. Only the cold precision of bureaucracy, as dangerous and invisible as smoke. Holmes, seated beside me in his customary dark frock coat and grey cravat, exuded a kind of quiet fire. He had brought with him a single folio, thin, unassuming, and devastating. Within it were the Addington letters, Ardwick's sworn statement, the Ashcombe deed, and a copy of the fraudulent suppression order. The chair of the inquiry, Sir George Mallory, adjusted his pince-nez as Holmes stood and began his account. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but surgical. Every name, every ledger entry, every forged signature fell into place like tiles in a mosaic. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. He simply laid the truth bare. And as he spoke, the faces around the long table paled. When he concluded, there was silence. Sir George folded his hands. "And your conclusion, Mr. Holmes, that a deliberate mechanism existed within the Land Holdings Ministry between 1888 and 1895 to delay, divert, or erase legitimate land claims?" Holmes replied, "And that the silence surrounding these estates was neither accidental nor benign. And your recommendation?" Holmes met the man's gaze evenly. "That you dig deeper, because the names I have presented are only the ones who left a trail. Others, I suspect, did not." He placed the folio on the table, and because England's justice must extend to the quiet corners, where deeds are sealed, not shouted, the committee recessed. Holmes and I stepped outside into the grey light of Parliament Square. Ashcroft met us at the gates. He held a copy of the findings, bound and initialed. "There will be consequences," he said. "You've lit a fuse." Mjeev gave a faint smile. "Then may the fire reach those who warmed their hands too long." The days that followed moved with strange quiet. The newspapers learned only fragments. "Deed Suppression Investigated" read one headline. "Parliamentary Review on Estate Manipulation" another. "Holmes declined all comment." "Blythe Swan resigned from his firm without public explanation." 2 clerks at the ministry were dismissed, and in the countryside, quiet estates stirred under new scrutiny. But the most telling moment came weeks later, when a letter arrived at Baker Street. It was postmarked from Dunstable. Inside was a simple card. No name, no signature, only 3 words. "Thank you both." Pressed between the card's folds was a single bluebell. One evening, not long after, I found Holmes on the rooftop of our building. He stood at the edge, looking down at the swirl of London gaslight and cobbled chaos. "You think it's finished," I said. "I know it isn't," he replied. "But you did enough." Holmes's hands rested lightly on the iron railing. "Watson," he said slowly, "have you ever considered how much of England is built on forgetting?" I didn't answer. He turned toward me. "It's easy to think of justice as an ending, but it's a door. One people step through, or ignore." "And what about us?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "We stand in the doorway, old friend, and we ask the questions." The wind rose above the rooftops. Somewhere below, a bell rang for evensong. Holmes looked once more across the city he had defended in shadow, with precision, with doubt, and with relentless clarity. Then he turned and walked back into the darkened stairwell. the faint scent of old paper and cold stone trailing behind him.